Now we turn to hopefully happier topics. We'll turn to sibling relationships and birth order. However, although this is a happier topic, let's start with some bad news. Research shows that when siblings are between 2 and 4 years of age, they average having a conflict every 10 minutes. Let's assume your kids are awake for about 12 hours. That's 12 hours times 6 conflicts per hour, or roughly 70 conflicts a day. Now, I can remember our kids were that age, and let me tell you, those were tough, tough days. So what is a parent supposed to do? Well, you got 3 options. You can intervene and try to resolve the conflict. You can threaten them to cut it out, or you can do nothing. There's probably not one answer for every situation. In fact, there are probably times when you need to use each one of these options. The important thing is to know your child, and as I said before, be one step ahead. So overall, when you're looking at sibling relationships, it's important to keep in mind 3 characteristics. One is the emotional quality of the relationship. Sibling relationships bring about both intensely positive as well as intensely negative emotions, especially the closer the kids are in age. It's also important to keep in mind the degree of familiarity and intimacy of the relationship. Siblings know each other very well. They know how to push each other's buttons. And by the way, this occurs all the way through life. I went to my uncle's funeral a couple of years ago, and my dad was sitting next to his younger brother, who's a year younger than he was, right? So, at this point, they're age 88 and 87, and they're sitting together, and my dad is getting irritated with his younger brother. I mean, that's just kind of the way it is. Siblings know each other really, really well, right? So they know how to push each other's buttons, and you can have all kinds of problems. So finally, the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that they are children after all, and they're subject to the same degree of cognitive and emotional immaturity that kids typically have at that age. Therefore, if your oldest is 4 and your second one is 2, the 4-year-old is going to act like a 4-year-old, and the 2-year-old is going to act like a 2-year-old. You simply cannot have unrealistic expectations. Also, keep in mind that there's a great deal of familiarity, right? And so anyway, remember there's a wide variation, but siblings are they're an interesting thing, right? Okay, next, when we talk about birth order, there's some research out there that indicates that there are some birth order effects of personality. For example, firstborns are generally thought about being as more intelligent, achieving, and conscientious, while laterborns are more rebellious, liberal, and agreeable. So compared to later born children, firstborn also have been described as more adult-oriented, helpful, conforming, and have more self-control. So one question is, what about only children? Well, generally only children and firstborn have similar characteristics. That is, they're often achievement-oriented, adult-oriented, and responsible. The overall point is you can document that there are birth order effects. However, it should be noted that these effects are usually quite small. So how do you explain birth order effects? The most common explanation is that there are fairly normal variations in the way that parents interact with their children. If you're the oldest, your parents are more likely to have higher demands on you because they just don't know what to expect, right? They're also likely to give you at least a little responsibility for your siblings. Likewise, if you're a younger sibling, parents naturally compare you to your older sibling, and they often give the older sibling some responsibility over you, right? So a little authority. So, however, it should be noted again that these effects are very small, and this means that there's going to be lots of families where the birth order effects don't run the way you think they would run, right? That is, their families where the firstborn is not necessarily the most intelligent, the most achieving, and conscientious. Also, you need to understand that, when I say maybe they're more achieving, not very much. This is not like one is going to be Einstein and the other is going to be dumb. This is like if you're taking standardized tests and you're to compare your standardized test scores across the years, maybe the oldest will outscore the youngest by a point or two, right? This is not, it's a consistent difference, but it's not a big difference, right? And finally, it's also good to remember that there's a lot of diversity within families. All right, next, the changing family. So working parents are the norm. more than 1 out of every 2 U.S. mothers with a child under the age of 5 is in the labor force. More than 2 out of 3 with a child from 6 to 17, that is school age, are going to be working. So research shows mixed outcomes for moms working outside the home. Many studies have found no overall negative effect of maternal employment on children's development. However, one concern is that the current generations of parents will have comparatively less influence over their children because the kids are spending so much time in daycare. So the critical variable that determines whether mom working outside the home is a positive or negative thing is the amount of stress that it creates. If mom has a stressful job and long hours, it's going to be harder on the kid. And it's going to do that for the practical reasons, such as the fact that the mom is going to be stressed and irritable. As for divorce, okay, here we go. First of all, it should be noted that the statistics that you hear about divorce are somewhat misleading. It is true that about 50% of marriages in the U.S. fail. However, among first marriages, there's a higher success rate. It's going to be about 60 to 65%. And you can up that number quite a bit if you are both college educated and you wait to get married. And if you add going to the same church and things like that on top of it, you can raise your rates of your chances of success up to close to 80%. So it is true that there's a high failure rate, but the thing that drags that rate down is people that marry and then they get remarried and then they get remarried again. Okay. So keep that in mind. That's one of the things. Another thing to keep in mind is that most divorces occur in the first 10 years of marriage, and divorce peaks between the years 7 and 8. There may really be such things as a 7-year itch after all. So overall, what this means is that divorce tends to peak when the family has the young children. In other words, having kids at this age, 4, 5, 3, they're right in there, and if you got multiple of them, it's stressful, and it's going to take its toll on the marriage. So now, divorce does have a negative impact on kids. There's a great deal of research which indicates that kids from divorced families generally show poorer adjustment in a wide number of domains. For example, children in divorced families are about 2.5 times more likely to have serious emotional problems. That would be 10% in about intact families and roughly 25% in divorced families. Typically, when parents go through a divorce, there's a fairly well-defined adjustment period that kids go through. The first 18 months to 2 years are the hardest for the kids. Kids do tend to do better after that. In fact, most kids, 75% to 80%, do recover from the divorce without long-term serious problems. On the other hand, the kids who do experience serious problems really experience serious problems, serious depression, suicidal tendencies, major problems, things like that. The point is, most kids will show some negative effects, and usually those effects usually last 1 to 2 years, but when there are problems, the problems can be serious. Now, our textbook also points out that divorce at times can be advantageous if the marital problems are affecting the well-being of the children. Again, we need to understand this correctly. There is no one simple answer here. There's a definite cost associated with divorce. Women typically lose a huge chunk of their income, from 1/4 to 1/2. Then there's moving out, which can mean new neighborhoods, schools, friends, jobs. There's potentially lots of new transitions, and transitions, even good ones, are stressful. The easy answer is to say, oh, it'll be better for the kids. But really, if the diminished resources and increased risks associated with divorce are also accompanied by inept parenting and sustained or increased conflict, not only will the divorced couple, but also the parents, the children, and siblings, it's gonna cause problems, right? So keep in mind that the thing that is most destructive to the child is the parental conflict. If the divorce ends the conflict, it can be advantageous for the child. If, however, even after the divorce takes place, the parents are still in conflict, which is often the case, there's really no advantage to the child. And don't kid yourself. If you have children, divorce does not end the relationship. There will be custody, there'll be visitation issues for years and years, often beyond the age of 18. The painful bottom line here is grown-ups have to act like grown-ups. Getting a divorce or not getting a divorce is not the most critical issue. Okay, do you hear me? Okay, getting a divorce or not getting a divorce is not the most critical issue. The critical issue for the development of healthy children is that you have two emotionally mature, stable, available parents. Therefore, for the mental health and well-being of your child, at some point, you'll have to act like adults. Therefore, you can grow up before you're married, while you're married, or after you get a divorce. But at some point, you have to grow up. I realize that may sound harsh, but that is just the reality. Otherwise, you're going to warp your kids. All right, now, here we go. This chart shows the percentage of single-parent families and in different countries. Notice that the U.S., that roughly about a quarter, 1 in 4 families will experience a single-parenthood, or that is kind of state for at least some period of time. So in addition to the psychological costs of divorce, it's also important to note that there are enormous social costs. Generally speaking, one of the greatest predictors of poverty is single parenthood. Every year, the U.S. government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on social services related to single parent families. Next. All right. Well, there we go. Gay, male, and lesbian parents. Okay, so 20% of lesbians, 10% of gay men are parents, okay? All right, if you do the math, there's roughly about, 2% of the population that's gay, okay? So you take 2% of 320 million, that's gonna be about 6.4 million. You take 2% of that, you take 20% of that, basically what you're getting at, and 10% of males, you're not talking about a large percentage of the population. Okay, so a lot of people get really, antsy about this topic, but you have to realize is this is a very small group of people, right? So researchers found very few differences between children growing up with lesbian mothers or gay fathers, okay? That is true, although there is other research out there that's like, maybe there is. I would say that there's probably, overall, from my reading of the research, the overall research, there's probably not much difference, but you have to realize there's such a small group that it's hard to generalize. They're just too small a sample. Anyway, keep that in mind. Next, all right, tips for adjusting after divorce. Here we go. All right, so explain separation. Explain it's not the kid's fault. Explain it takes time to feel better. Keep the door open. All of those kind of things. So that's one of the last things to keep in mind there. And it's important to note that children's adjustment tends to be better when the parents have, again, an authoritative style of parenting. That means being firm but fair, loving but having high standards, and it means talking through things so that the kids understand them and being a good role model and working things out. Therein lies the irony of it all. If parents can act that way towards their children, why can't they act that way towards each other when they're married? Nonetheless, if you can practice authoritative parenting, it will help the child's adjustment. It's also important to realize that different children handle divorce differently, so you need to know what risk and vulnerability factors your kids may have. For example, children who are socially mature and responsible show fewer behavior problems, and the same is true for having an easy temperament. Those kids tend to cope better. Let's see, next. Here we go. All right, so another major factor that influences kids is socioeconomic status. As the slide points out, the average families, on average, families that are characterized as being lower socioeconomic status tend to be more concerned about their children's conforming to society's expectations. They tend to be more authoritarian. They tend to use more physical punishment, and they tend to be more directive and less conversational with their children. Okay, families that are higher on the socioeconomic scale, by contrast, are more concerned with developing their own child's initiative, and they're more likely to create a home atmosphere characterized by equality and discussion, and they're less likely to use physical punishment. They're more likely to be directive, or less directive in some ways, but more conversational with their children. And what's important here is to realize that socioeconomic status is really not about the money or ethnicity, it's about the values, okay? That is, if you hold a certain set of values, regardless of your income or your race or things like that, if you carry on these values that they're talking about, such as what we're just talking about, then you know your kids are going to take in those kind of values, right? So that's that. Let's see. Okay, we'll pause here and we'll go on to the next one.